All right, so welcome to our Delve lecture with Dr. Ryan Alaniz. My name is Sophie, and my co-lead Wyatt and I are part of the Veritas Forum at Cal Poly. So the Veritas Forum is like an international college ministry that engages students in the discussions of life's hardest questions and faith. Our campus Veritas Forum hosts a large forum once a year and smaller dialogues like this 2 to 3 times a quarter. This year, our Winter Veritas Forum addressed racial injustice in government, religious institutions, and higher education. One of the main focuses and takeaways of the speakers was for us to educate ourselves on our nation's racial history, learn about the criminal justice system, and get involved with making change locally. In particular, they stressed the importance of moving from performative posting on social media to actively working with local organizations to make change. So after a forum, we decided to continue our conversation of racial injustice and host a dialogue diving further into the criminal justice system and how we can enact racial justice in our local communities. So despite this being a campus ministry, this discussion will not cover religious topics. Instead, we'll be focusing on the application of getting involved in our SLO community and learning from the experience and wisdom of Dr. Alaniz. So this is our first Delve dialogue of the spring quarter, and we're so excited to introduce you to Dr. Ryan Alaniz.
Yeah. So Ryan Alaniz, he is an associate professor of sociology at Cal Poly, where he teaches courses on international and political economy, social change, incarceration, and social inequality. He has volunteered for several community-based national and international organizations that are dedicated to improving the lives of disaster survivors, marginalized groups, and those behind bars. Dr. Alaniz's publication includes his book, From Strangers to Neighbors, Post-Disaster Resettlement and Community Building in Honduras, and various collaborations for the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, the White House, and the Natural Hazard Center. His current book project, entitled Social Problems, Perspectives of the Incarcerated, draws on inmate narratives to examine social issues in the U.S.
So now we'll start a dialogue with Dr. Alaniz. So thank you so much for coming. So speaking of working with people incarcerated, a key issue being discussed right now, and one that often corresponds with racial justice, is the criminal justice system. So could you tell us a bit about your background teaching inside the California Men's Colony and the county jail?
Yes. So first, thank you, Sophie, Wyatt, and Dr. Mark for inviting me to talk a little bit about this subject. And it's actually quite relevant because I don't know if all of you know, Cal Poly shares a fence line with the California Men's Colony where 4,000 people are incarcerated. More than 80% of which have had COVID, by the way, in part because we didn't vaccinate the population and they live in very tight quarters. And so, as you know, Cal Poly has the motto, learn by doing. For me, what does that look like in terms of sociology? For agriculture, it's simple. You go out and you work in the fields, or engineering, you may build something. But what about sociology? What I found is that our students are graduating with sociology degrees in criminal justice concentrations without ever having stepped foot into the county jail or met with somebody who's been incarcerated. And that was a problem. So if they're going to go out and become lawyers or judges or work with this population, they need to meet this population and hear their perspective. So I developed a class 6 years ago called Incarceration in Society, where I bring in 8 Cal Poly students and we have a class with 8 women that are incarcerated. So we go into the jail, we have class in the jail, and then we are able to leave again, but the women are not. And I ask questions like, is society just? And we dialogue about how our society treats different individuals. And interestingly, the students often think that what we call the outside students, or the students from Cal Poly, often look at that question, is society just? And they're like, no, it's not just at all. And the women inside say, well, yeah, it actually is. I deserve to be in here. So it becomes this really interesting dialogue around value and power and structures of society that lead some people to be incarcerated and some people not. And then at Cuesta College, some of you may know that Cuesta College has a program where they teach classes at the California Men's Colony State Prison, and they offer an associate's degree of transfer for men that are living there to then be able to move forward and get their bachelor's degree some someplace else. And in this case, the associate's degree is in sociology. So I've actually, over the last few years, been working on developing a new bachelor's degree program so that Cal Poly faculty can go next door and teach upper division courses to the men that are incarcerated. There's hundreds of men on the waiting list to get into these quested classes, and there's soon going to be more than 100 men prepared to start their third year, their junior year at Cal Poly, if we're able to find funding. So that's the crux right now, is to find funding. So yeah, I've had a really quite amazing experience, both in the county jail where people live. And the difference between jail and prison, for those of you who don't know, jail is usually for people who have done a crime that's less than a year, or they've been, they're either waiting for sentencing or they've been sentenced for less than a year. And prison is for people that have been incarcerated or sentenced for more than a year.
Great, thank you. And then, so as we mentioned earlier, you're now working on a book entitled like Social Problems, Perspectives of the Incarcerated. From your experience, what are some of the problems you've witnessed within the system? And what have you learned from your time spent working with the prison and people incarcerated?
Yeah, so I'll start with just a couple of statistics to put things in perspective, and then I'll share some stories as well. So the United States is 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's incarcerated. So a quarter of the world's population that's incarcerated is here in our, and we have, we've been building prisons at a rate that's significantly higher than we have university or colleges. Additionally, it costs Californians $81,000 a year to incarcerate one person for 1 year. So more than going, maybe 2 or 3 people going to Cal Poly, that's how much it costs to incarcerate somebody. And unfortunately, more than 80% of them will recidivate or go back to prison within 10 years. So we talk about it's called the California Department of Corrections, and they just added this, and rehabilitation. So California Departments of Corrections and Rehabilitation, but there isn't any real rehabilitation going on. If that were the case, why would 4 out of 5 of them return to prison? So it's still a mentality of they've done something wrong, let's throw away, let's put them behind bars and throw away the key. And there's a huge number of other issues that go along with that as well, including racism. And then even once people get out of prison, they face up to 40,000 new challenges in terms of being able to get a job, get housing, they can't get an educational loan to go back to school. They can't do certain jobs, like if they're a felon, they can't become a barber. They can't receive a barber certificate. So there's all these, even though they've done their time, they still can't get a job. So what do? They go right back to what they knew before, which is usually drugs. And more than 80% of them has to do with drugs. So our system is really created, it's been deeply embedded, these institutions that are very problematic. And so they target mostly Black and brown people. If you go to California Men's Colony, you're going to see mostly Black and brown people. They target poor people, because when you look at the incarceration of people around here, if they really wanted to crack down on drugs in the San Luis Obispo County, instead of going to places like Oceana, which is mostly Latino, they should come to Cal Poly, right? But that's not the case. They're never going to come to Cal Poly, because Cal Poly students are seen as just trying things out. It's not a big deal, and they definitely don't want the bad PR. They don't want it to come down on the institution and on the university, and they don't want wealthy parents yelling at them for arresting their kids for doing drugs. So there's just a lot of problems embedded, not only in the policing, and I'm on a committee with the Sheriff's Department, but also in incarceration as well. And it needs to be overhauled. It can't just be these, sometimes they try and do little things to try and fix it here and there, but it really does need to be reviewed and updated to address the major issues that we have. Sorry, that's a really long answer, and I know I kind of weaved around a bunch of different things.
No, that's great. I
I'll
do.
just I'll just tell you one story before we move on. So I met this woman, Linda, at the county jail. She was part of my class, one of my first classes. And we never ask about people's crime because it's really none of our business. But nevertheless, she was willing to share. And so she was sharing to the class. And she said that she grew up in Lompoc, which is, maybe 45 minutes south, 50 minutes south of San Luis Obispo. She grew up poor. She had a number of brothers and sisters. And, education was never really on her mind. So in high school, she ended up getting pregnant and having a child at 17. So she dropped out of high school to raise her child. And she married the guy who got her pregnant because then they could be together and then hopefully he would support her, which he did for a little while. And soon she had a second kid and then a third kid. So by 21, she had 3 kids and was with this 20-year-old man. But this man really was not happy with the situation and ended up becoming emotionally and later physically abusive towards Linda. But Linda had no choice except to be with him. She had 3 kids. Her family couldn't take her because they were poor already. They couldn't take 4 more people. She had no economic support or safety net wouldn't allow her to survive on her own. She couldn't have gotten housing and a job and everything else with 3 kids. So she had to figure out a way to cope with the situation. So she turned to cocaine because cocaine allowed her to survive this abuse. And one day she got pulled over and she had cocaine in the car and the kids in the car. And so she got taken to jail and her kids were taken away from her. Now, when you hear that, oh, this woman had cocaine in her car and she had her kids in the car, I mean, that they immediately like, what kind of terrible mother is this? What kind of situation? And I agree. I don't think any mother should be on cocaine with their kids in the car or have cocaine. But nevertheless, when I take a step back and I look at the broad situation, could I have really made a better decision than what she had made? Can I say that I would have done something different than she would have? So John Benford, again, this is a couple of centuries ago, back in London, he has this great quote. He was walking past 3 men who had just been hung for their crimes. And he looks up at them and he says, "But for the grace of God go I." The idea being that had I maybe grown up in that situation, had I been, with the same family and the same education and the same opportunities, it probably would have been me hanging up there. And that's how I feel whenever I teach in CMC or the county jail. These guys I'm not better than these guys or women. I just had different life chances and context. And if I had grown up like they had, I was talking to one of the guys in there, he saw his father murdered when he was 9 years old in their living room, and his mother was a crack addict. What chances did he have to survive at 9 years old with that kind of situation? And so I have a lot of empathy and compassion for the men and women who are incarcerated because I think that they probably did the best that they could with what they had available to them. It's not to take away that they shouldn't have consequences for their behavior, but nevertheless, I think these consequences should be focused on rehabilitation, not just locking somebody behind 6 feet of concrete and razor wire.
Yeah, that brings up a great point about like humility in our perspectives for other people. And as a follow-up to that, and to put it into perspective, how long has the educational program been going on in the county jail and the California Men's Colony? And then have you seen any like examples of the education aspect being able to help rehabilitate the incarcerated?
Absolutely. So the county jail and the county jail was started by me. I'm the only one that teaches classes there. So that's only been going on 6 years. And I think the Cuesta program has been going on about 5 years. And there's only a handful of colleges and universities across the country that have these kind of programs. So it's not a really common effort yet. And in fact, California Men's Colony is actually quite progressive compared to most, probably spam, compared to most prisons around the country. A lot of prisons in the South have a lot more harsher conditions. But the statistics illustrate, I mean, this actually comes out of a university in Texas. What they found is that when people, so the recidivism rate is around 80 something percent, 84% within 9 years, according to the FBI. And they found when you follow people who have gotten a bachelor's degree, that number drops to 6%. Because if somebody has a bachelor's degree and leaves prison, then they have so many more opportunities available to them. Plus, hopefully they have more maturity, they have a broader worldview, they've learned new skills, they're better writers, they have just a lot more options available for them for work and for thinking about the world differently than the mentality they did when they came into prison. And so that statistic in and of itself, Democrat or Republican, think about how much money it would save if we were able to give folks an education while incarcerated. And then what kind of tax base, how would it really encourage our local economy if people are getting out, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people are getting out and starting new businesses, starting new jobs, coming up with new ideas. So there's a lot of opportunity available if we're to focus on education in prison.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And then moving on more to the how we can get involved. As a member of the Cal Poly community and an executive committee member of the NAACP in SLO, what social issues do you think the SLO and Cal Poly community should focus on helping change right now?
Ooh, there are so many. But definitely racial justice has been a big issue, both in the college, at Cal Poly, and in the community. So you may know that Cal Poly is the most homogenous. It's the most white university in California, public university, and it's the wealthiest, according to students' family wealth. So one, that's not necessarily a good thing. For example, we had a Boeing representative come to an Engineers Without Borders meeting a few years ago. And this Boeing representative was talking so positively about the engineering program at Cal Poly. He said that the engineers coming out of Cal Poly were the best trained engineers at their company. And immediately after he said, but they don't know how to work with people that don't look just like them. And so that's really a loss for our university, that the private sector is telling us that we need to address that. And we need to figure out how to bring in more diversity, more diverse voices, more experiences of people from around the world, from locally, to bring those into our classrooms. So I think racial justice issues, diversity issues, both in the community and at Cal Poly. One huge one that's about to hit the ground in the next few months is that the federal government and Health and Human Resources will be sending thousands, likely thousands of immigrant children to Camp Roberts, which is about an hour north of here. And I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but the children living in cages run by the Border Patrol, they're going to be replaced or displaced and resettled, likely just north of us in Camp Roberts, among other locations. And I think that'll be an amazing opportunity for us to serve these children who really had no choice in the matter of migrating 3,000 miles from Central America. Another organization is called Race Matters. Race Matters is a local organization. I know the executive director, and they're doing a lot of great work on diversity issues and racial justice issues locally. Of course, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which I'm a part of, as you mentioned. We're having a rally tonight from 6 to 7:15 at the courthouse in downtown San Luis Obispo. So there's ways to get involved with this organization, which is the oldest, they call it the oldest and boldest racial justice organization in the country. It's been around since 1903, I think. And then, of course, asking your college, the college that you're in, what's being done. So often students don't feel like they have a lot of power. I think at Cal Poly, don't think that faculty or administrators listen to them, but in fact they do. They have a lot of power. And if a student starts to ask questions about how is the College of Engineering, how is the College of Agriculture, architecture, how are they addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, then the chairs and the deans have to answer. And they should have a good answer. And if you don't like the answer, tell them, well, why aren't you doing more? And here are some examples of what else you could be doing. College of Liberal Arts is on the cutting edge of that. And the question could be, well, why aren't we doing as much as the College of Liberal Arts? And of course, we in the College of Liberal Arts could be doing more as well. But from faculty hiring to different classes to bringing in more diverse students to more events with people of different backgrounds. There's just a lot that could be done that's not being done at Cal Poly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think students are the most innovative. What do you guys want to see? This is your education. You're paying a lot of money to be here. What is it that you want that you're not getting out of your education as it relates to diversity and equity?
That's a great point. Yeah. And then going off of what we were talking about earlier with the the performative social justice online, that was something that was brought up during our winter forum. As our speakers highly encouraged students to move past just social media activism and getting involved in their communities. And you brought up some great examples of how we can do that. But I do think that posting on social media can still be beneficial. But to what extent does posting on social media and signing petitions help achieve justice? How can we be intentional with what we post?
That's a good question. So I think the first thing that anybody would tell you, and I'm just going to put in a document for everyone in the chat,
Mm-hmm.
We need to do our own work first. So despite our best efforts, we still carry around a lot of unconscious bias. And it takes us every single day, we should be thinking about how is our unconscious bias coming out. So I'll give you an example. I never had a Black faculty member until I was in my PhD program. So through my K through 12, Cal Poly, my master's degree, and finally I had one in my PhD program. I only saw negative stereotypes and negative representations on the media about African Americans growing up, except for the Cosby Show. I learned negative stereotypes in what I read. There weren't a lot of Black students at Cal Poly, so I didn't have those interactions. So when I grew up, when I became an adult, I had negative bias towards African Americans, and I still do, because it's so deeply embedded in my unconscious. I don't think anybody in this country isn't impacted in a way that negatively reinforces certain demographics, certain races, certain ethnicities, and positively represents others. And so I need to ask myself, whenever I meet somebody new, whenever I'm interacting with somebody in a group, how might my unconscious bias be coming up? How might I try to address this unconscious bias? And so there are some resources on that website that I just shared that will help you become an ally. I think just posting on social media sometimes can just relieve guilt. It can be just a matter of well, I posted Black Lives Matter, pat myself on the back, I don't have to think about it for the next month. And that's not the case. To be an ally, you should be thinking about it in every interaction that you have, and you should be reading about it, and you should be learning more about things like white privilege, and the privileges and the things that Black folks are up against. So There was an example that came up actually on social media, so I guess there are some real positives to it, but on Facebook, where somebody said, you know, if you say you have Black friends, but you're not deeply embedded in trying to figure out how Black Lives Matter and working towards more equity with African Americans in our society, then you don't really have Black friends. You know Black people. And I think that was quite an interesting differentiation, because if you really had friends, then you would really be empathizing and learning and trying to understand their perspective and their experience, rather than just saying that you have friends. If you really have dear friendships, then you're going to do more to try and support them in their lives and ensure that they don't that they're not afraid that when they're pulled over by the police. There was another example that came up. It's like, well, every time you see a Black person pulled over by a police officer, think about stopping and just being a witness. And and it's not all police officers, but that will give a sign to the police officer that people are watching and they're going to be held accountable, because they're only now being held accountable after hundreds of years of abuse. Same thing if you see a faculty member put down or somehow dismiss, gaslight a person of color. It's up to the white person. It's more effective if the white person calls out a white person than if a Black person does, because they'll just say, oh, it's just an angry Black person, just an angry Black man, and dismiss them again. Whereas there's a differential in power, where if it's a white person talking to a white person, then they're going to listen differently than if it's a Black person saying, hey, wait a minute, this isn't right. So I think there is a role in social media, but I think probably maybe one of the best things that we all could do, and just like I shared with you right now, is our own vulnerability. The fact that we all recognize our unconscious bias. If we're able to say that out loud to our friends and family, then maybe they will start to be open and vulnerable and start to look at their own biases as well. And then sharing things like the document that I have, that, well, here's some ways to start to think about and address these types of biases. So many folks, and even in my own family, don't think that they're racist. And they're right. They don't draw swastikas on the sidewalk. They're not part of the KKK. But through their unconscious bias, through the way they vote, even through what they buy, through the way they think about the world, they're kind of racist. They are racist. They have these biases that demean and negatively impact people of color. And so our job, I think, is first always to start with the people closest to us. If we think about it in rings, if we're a rock in a pond, and then maybe our friends and our family and our community, and start to expand out. But if we're not doing it first in here, then our words, our walk and our talk don't match. And so why would anybody try and listen to us on social media?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I like the point that you brought up, that if we are to be an ally, it has to be part of every part of our life. I think that's really powerful.
I think too, just on that point, if it's comfortable, then you're not really making change. If it's easy, you're not really doing anything. If you're not getting pushback, are you really making change? Because yeah, it's easy again on social media to do hashtag Black Lives Matter. There's no pushback there. So that means you're not really changing anything. You know you're changing something when you start to get pushback and people are like, hey, wait a minute, why did you post that? Or hey, wait a minute, I don't agree. And then you can start having the conversation, hopefully respectfully. So I guess, again, the patting yourself on the back or taking it, doing things that aren't really impactful, that's the risk of social media. But there are ways, of course, as you mentioned, that you can influence family members and friends through your social media accounts.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, the last question we have prepared for you is before Q&A is, what advice do you have for students who want to get involved in local activism or who want to start these really difficult conversations with their friends and family?
for me, I guess it's always to start in the place of humility and to start with one's own vulnerability and to say, hey, you know, if just think about it for yourself. If somebody brings up something hard for you or something hard, how do you want them to approach you? Like, hey, you're racist. Not going to go very far. But if you said, hey, you know, I'm learning a lot about this issue of racial justice. It's so much on the news. And I can't believe that I have all this unconscious bias that I never even thought about. Let me just share some resources with you. Here's the way I used to act towards African Americans. Like I unconsciously didn't sit next to an African American one time. And now I look back, I'm like, I wonder if that's because of my bias. I think that that's the best way to approach, is just sharing from personal experience, because if they care about you, they're going to listen. And if they listen to you from that perspective, I think that they might be willing to start to ask those same questions that you're asking. So that would be the first departure. The second is sometimes in public, you have to be the ally and stand up and say, hey, this is wrong. This is not okay. And in that way, we can call out people in power, whether it's a faculty member, whether it's just another student, or whether it's a police officer. We can stand up and say, hey, this isn't right. And in that way, that will affect change too. Whether or not they agree with you or not, at least they're recognizing that they're being held accountable for their actions and their words. So I think that those two places would be a good place to start, and learn and always keep listening. And the most important thing is not to dismiss the experiences of people of color. So often, and this happened in the sheriff's meeting yesterday by one of the administrators at the sheriff's department. He said, one of the men from the committee said, you know, my sister just the other day was walking down the street and a sheriff's patrol drove past. He was black and his sister's black. And then that sheriff's patrol turned around, came back, and went past her a second time. And the administrator at the sheriff's office said, well, you didn't know his intention. That sheriff's deputy might have gotten the call and figured out, like, maybe he was just checking something else out. And that's gaslighting. That's saying that your experience isn't valid, when the experience of that, I mean, maybe that was the case, but probably 9 times out of 10, it was because, why is a black person walking in downtown San Luis Obispo? We better check them out. And so being very careful to make sure that we listen to and respect the experience and stories of people of color. Because whether or not we agree with them, that's their experience, and we have to trust that. So always listen humbly and say, yeah, I hear you, and I want to learn more about what your experience is like, and not to try and dismiss it or argue it away or find some kind of justification for it.
Thank you so much.